Good evening. Thank you to everyone for being here. I'm Sharon Weber from University of Wisconsin, and my co-moderator is Greg Kennedy from University of Alabama. This is the SSAT Writers Workshop, and just to let you know, this is structured as a meeting, so you will see that you'll actually be able to see the participants and people with their cameras on, and you will also be able to ask questions in the chat function, and everyone will be able to see those questions. This is because it's live and set up as a meeting. We could pause and ask questions anywhere along the way. But what we've kind of planned is to hold the questions until the end of our 3 great talks that we have this evening. You can see those outlined here. But if there is a burning question that you have or you have to leave, just see if you can raise your hand or ask in the chat, and we can intervene in the middle of the session if needed. So with that, I will hand it off to Greg to introduce our first speaker. And I welcome all of you to tonight's session. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks, Sharon. Our first speaker, we have, as you can see, we have quite an incredible lineup of speakers tonight. And our first speaker is Dr. V Costa Deja, who's my friend and colleague here at the University of Alabama at Birmingham. He's the current Chief of Surgical Oncology, Director of the Division of Surgical Oncology here in the Department of Surgery. And he's well-versed and certainly in a great position to talk about his topic, which is open access journals, pros and cons. V-Costa, thanks for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Greg, and thank you, Sharon. It's really a great opportunity for me to come here and be able to speak to you all. Let me see screen 2. Can you see this? So the topic that I am talking about is open access journal. Nowadays, there's a lot of chat about, are they good? Is it worth publishing in open access journal? So I want to cover some of those topics and talk about what is paying to read versus paying to publish. So the typical scientific publishing model is the old model where you want to publish either to advance your career, or is it about advancing the science, or both? And then you work very hard and finally you put together this manuscript. This manuscript, you send it to one of the publishing companies, which for example is Nature. Now Nature gets your manuscript. If it finds worthy of sending it even for review, they will send it out to reviewers. Now these reviewers provide the critique, you go to and fro, and voila, it is found suitable for publication. So what does the journal does? Journal sends it for printing, which in old times used to be typesetting and old type printing. And then these are put together in a journal form and sent out for shipping to all the different institutes nationally or internationally. Now, in this old model, if somebody wants to really read your research, they have to either have a subscription, or they need to, or your institute from which you can get, from the library, you can get these manuscripts, or and they need to have a subscription. So basically, even though the journal may charge you for some money for typesetting or printing or color printed or pages per page cost, as such, your manuscript is accepted free of cost, but the reader pays a certain amount of money to read the manuscript. Now, what this does is that without the free-flowing system, access to the result of scientific research is limited to the institutions which are able to pay that hefty journal subscriptions. And that subscriptions can run into thousands of dollars. So what this essentially does is it's putting that wonderful research that you have done behind paywalls. So what is the argument for open access? And I'll talk about what open access is. But for science to optimally work for the betterment of society, there has to be an open dialogue. People should be able to read your research, critique it, check it in their system, and then improve on for the betterment of the society. Now, the times have changed. In old times, getting documents to and from the reviewers required a lot of effort. Once the manuscripts were accepted, there was extensive typesetting, designing, which was required. And then the printing was really a laborious process. And then once the hardcover journals were published, they had to be distributed throughout the world. Now, in current times, there is immense computing power available to everybody. There's increased productivity, which makes the typesetting and those kind of layout design very, very easy. And also, you don't have to distribute the physical copies. If you have internet, you have access to the journals. Also, there's realization that journals are not doing the research. They're not writing the manuscripts. They're not even paying the reviewers. And then once that research is out in open, then they put it behind these paywalls and benefit from from doing all this research. More so, there's a societal argument. The public is paying taxes, which is helping hire these scientists, surgeon scientists in these public universities. Government is funding the research. And once there's a result of that research goes behind these paywalls, and public itself, who had paid all these taxes for this research, have to pay again to get the benefit of research. So there comes the concept of open access. What is open access? Where the research, the manuscripts are available digitally, online, free of charge, and free of most copyright and licensing restrictions. So this is basically the concept of open accesses. All open access are not created equal. These are the various kind of open access. The gold access is, for an example, will be a PLOS One journal, right? Where once the article is accepted, there's a fees charged at the time of article acceptance. And once it's accepted and a fees is paid, it is available online, available for anybody who wants. Then the next level is hybrid journals. Now, in hybrid system, the journal is a subscription-based, has a subscription-based system. But if you pay a certain fees, then the article can be available to public in an open access format. So not all the articles are open access, but certain articles which have paid that open access fees are available. There is another kind of open access, that's green open access. In this, the journal is not open access, but because of certain requirement. For example, NIH requires that every manuscript which is resulting from the research that they have funded should be available in publicly available repository. So you can see when you go on PubMed, you can see that you can go to journal site or a PubMed article is available. They can be, not finished copies, but not really nicely formatted like in journal, but that's known as green. So it's available to everybody, no fees is required. And then there is bronze access. Bronze access is when the publishers put the articles on the websites. They are available for everybody to use, but a fees has not been paid, and they can basically put it behind the paywall anytime they decide so. Now, the open access movement really took great steam in around 2018, when there was a group of mostly European funders, some international funders, some societies like Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which put forth the Plan S, or known as S for shock. The plan is that any research which is funded by these agencies has to be available open access. That is the requirement from their end. Now, all the journals in Europe are making it available and trying to comply with this requirement using different ways. In USA, this has gone a little slowly. For example, right now, NIH requires any federally funded research to be open access, but there is an embargo period of about 12 months. After that, it has to be available on PubMed, free of cost, if it is NIH funded. This is how the open access has really taken off. It started taking off steam in 2000s. And in 2017 is when the number of open access published articles have actually overtaken the not open access, which is shown in gray. So now let's get into the meat of the matter. What's the good, the bad, and the ugly of open access? Well, let's start with the good. So open access, since it's widely and easily available, it has a wider reach, visibility, and citations. You must have faced a lot of situations where you're writing a paper and you're sitting at home, you're not on the university internet connection, and then you're trying to Google search or PubMed search, and there is an article which seems like good, but you're not able to get the contents. And if you're writing an article on a weekend, then in that case, the chances of you citing that paper is actually less as compared to one which is freely available. So that's what the data would suggest. So there was a study done by Eisenbeck et al., which was published in PLOS Biology. It compared the citations of about 1,400 articles which were published in PNAS. Now, PNAS is open access. I think it is open access after certain duration, like 6 months or so. So there were some articles which were published in certain durations. Some were open access off the bat, and some were open access only after certain duration. So, and they controlled for the number of days of publications, number of authors, the quality, and the area of the subject which was being covered. And what they observed is that 14% article were open access off the bat. 85% were open access, not immediately, but later on. I don't remember. I think it's after 6 months. And then they compared the citation, how many citations they got. So what they saw is that the open access articles were more likely to get more number of citations, and this ratio or the more likelihood of citation increased with time. For example, they were 1.7 times more likely to be cited 0 to 6 months after publication, but after 10 months, they were 3 times more likely as compared to non-open access articles. So open access articles are also not only more likely to be cited, they are actually read widely, spread widely, and also available to the lay community. So not only the academician who are reading your articles, the lay community will also, while searching for a certain disease or certain entity, will come across your article and read it. And this was obvious through a joint project which was between Springer Nature and the Association of Universities in the Netherlands and Dutch University Library. So they did analysis of about, I think 22,000 articles or so, which were on the Springer Nature website. And they also surveyed about 6,000 readers which came on that site. What they found is that, so there were 3 kind of articles which were subscription, hybrid gold access. If you remember, I talked about some articles which are partially open access, some are open access all throughout. So the one which were open access were more likely to be downloaded, more likely to have a higher altmetrics attention score. Now, altmetric attention score is a composite of an article's mention on social media, news stories, and policy documents. So they were more likely to be mentioned in those kind of situations. And also, they had more citation. Now, I do want to mention that if, as a whole, they were less likely to be cited, but when you control for various factors, including what the articles were about, how many authors, as we talked about in the last study, they were more likely to be cited as well. So this again says that the open access articles have a wider reach and also have a more mention in the lay community. Now, they also looked at what these readers who were coming to the website and looking at these articles. The 40% of audience were non-academics, which are not involved in research. 15% were professional, but they didn't have to publish. And 28 were completely lay people looking for various disease processes. So what this suggests is that open access leads to really wider access of your research, which is again for the benefit of the general community. Now, Open access is also good for low resource communities and countries. So I trained in India, and I can tell you that during my early thesis writing and early surgical training, you had to really go to the library, find the journals, and try to find what the source is. And many of the journals were not subscribed in our library. So the effect may not be as clearly visible when we are on internet at our institutes, which have a wide subscription. But low resource communities and countries really suffer because of this. And we routinely get emails telling, hey, I really read your article. Can you please send me a copy? We don't have it available in our library. So that's very, very important. And this also became the attention of the publishers as well as NIH became even more acute, is clear from the fact that during COVID time, all the articles about COVID were put open access. Again, that suggests because you want whatever is your research to be widely available quickly. And if that is true in a pandemic setting, then I think it is true in as such also. Then the other thing which we want to think about with open access is that it's free of most copyright and licensing requirement. Please note that if any article is open access, it does not mean they don't have copyright. The gold access one, and you should be able to see what kind of copyright a certain article has by going to the website of the journal. If they have what they call at CC by copyright, what that means is you can use that data in any shape, way, or form till the time the author as well as the journal is properly cited in the area that you're using. So to give you an example, this is the, if you go to JAMA, for reprints, you know, the authors can get only so many reprints free of cost. And then after that, you have to pay. And each and every article needs to, if you want a reprint. And similarly, if you want to use part of the article for any other purposes, you need to get permission. And this is from PLOS as well as from MDPI, where they say that no special permission is required to use this article. These are open access. If you have Creative Commons CC BY license, so you can use it. Just all you have to do is article should be clear, original article should be clearly cited. And you can, of course, as mentioned, open access, you can distribute it to your heart's content. You can easily put it as a link to your Facebook page, your lab's website, and you are not infringing any copyright issues. Now, also, open access has been linked to quicker publication. And the speed of publication and getting it online is much quicker. Also because the journals don't have to wait for all the articles to accumulate to make a proper issue or a volume. These are put on the website as soon as they are available. And so they are seems to be faster getting to the people who need them. Now, what are the bads of open access? Of course, the cost. Now the open access cost is slowly becoming cost of doing research. Somebody has to pay that cost, and which could be author's institute, or the funding agency. Now the cost is being shifted from the person who wants to read it to those who want to publish it. And this can be a serious problem. Just like availability of articles is a problem in low resource country institutes or individuals, same, the low resource country institutes or individual could be penalized if open access, because you have to pay a hefty amount for the articles to be published. Now, many open access articles will provide rebates as well as free of cost publication for some of the low resource places, but then you again have to go through the hoops to get that benefit. And also there's a concern about quality of prestige. So there was a survey in 2014 by Nature and Macmillan, where they surveyed 22,000 academicians about their concerns and about the quality of open access. And these had not published three months prior in any of the open access journal. And 40% of scientists voice concern that they perceive, at least, that the quality of open access journal is lesser than the non-open access journal. Mind you, open access has not been around as long as what the subscription journal has been there. Now, this bad perception is seemingly getting better, because a similar survey in 2015 showed that 27% of academicians only felt that open access was not the way to go. Also, open access journal, as I mentioned, tend to have low impact factor. But even the prestigious journal like JCI now has a JCI Insight, which is a totally open access. So even the prestigious journal are starting, and you can find decent impact factor journal based on the area that you are publishing in. Now, what's the ugly of open access? That's the predatory journals. These are the journals. There's not a clear definition which are the predatory journals. So actually there was a summit in 2019 organized by Nature, which the findings are actually published in Nature about what is a definition of predatory journals. So these are the journals which are publishing for a fee, which all are, but they are not providing proper peer review or editing service. Mind you that in this open access world, you don't have to get the quality very good, because you're getting paid right off the bat. So you can, the more you publish, the more is the revenue for the journal. So that has driven this kind of a predatory journal environment. And these journals are actually driven by financial interest. They are deviating from best editorial and publication practices because they do not follow proper standards. They don't provide a policy for retraction, copyright transfer, and all the important pillars of good publishing. And they have lack of transparency. And this is important because when you're, and I'll cover in the next slide, how do you find it's a predatory journal? They don't have any contact detail. They have lack of information on fee structure. They don't have a good website. Editors and members of editorial boards cannot be verified. And many of us get emails. The first email see in the morning is a repeated email from a same journal saying that, you know, submissions are urgently needed for our forthcoming issues. So please be very, very mindful of these kind of journals. How do you, before publishing in any of the open access journal, you can see if a journal is predatory or not by searching the directory of open access journal. It is openly available. You can search for the quality of a journal on this website. Then if a journal is indexed in Medline, it does not guarantee it's not a predatory journal, but less likely that it is a predatory journal. If you search for a certain journal and search in Google, actually you will see many blogs and stories that please don't publish there, or this is a bad journal and those kind of things. And then there are lists like Cabell's predatory reports, which talks about a list of journals which have been, which are giving signs of being predatory journal and should be avoided. So in summary, I think the question pros and cons is there, but I think open access is here to stay. You can, based on your demands, look for open access journal with a good standing. For example, JCI has a JCI Insight, as I talked about. It's a very good journal, high quality papers are being published. Open access is actually aligned with the spirit of science. It improves access in the developing world, but in a counter world, it could create a challenge for the people in the low resourced places to be able to publish. It improves citation as well as engagement of the journal public. And please watch out for the predatory journal. Well, I really thank you for the opportunity to be able to present. And of course, we will be happy to take any questions you may have in the end.
Vikas, thanks so much. That was a great talk. Really appreciate that perspective. And we have nothing in the chat right now. Does anyone have a question they want now? We're happy to hold questions to the end. Okay.
I have a question.
Sure, Tim, go ahead.
Who pays for open access at your institution? maybe I missed that, but it can be quite expensive. So sometimes faculty members approach me and ask for funds to support publishing in open access. So how does that get handled?
So right now, if somebody has a funding, that is covered through the funding, because when you're writing the grants and stuff, you are basically building in certain amount of money for publications. Otherwise, in our division, we have been covering this through the professional funds.
You meaning your business expenses?
Somewhat. I mean, because our professional fund is bigger, but then it does go into your P&L. So we do have a bigger professional funds.
I would say at our place, Tim, we are definitely using funding if people have funding, whether it's startup or other grants, but then relying on professorships, which really trying to make sure that people aren't paying for it out of their pocket, but finding other mechanisms through philanthropy or other grant really are probably the highest utilized options. I don't know if anyone else wants to touch base on that topic. Okay, any follow-up on that, Tim?
No, I think it's something that all of our institutions are going to have to grapple with in the future. I mean, I think obviously if it's written into your funding, that's easier to deal with. Frequently, though, there's unfunded research that people want to publish in these journals, and it can cost, as you know, over $1,000 to publish in these papers, in these journals rather. And so, I think moving forward, developing departmental or institutional policies. I also do think that some of the publishing companies will probably begin to negotiate deals with the consortia with regards to the number of open access papers that a given institution may be able to publish in a specific journal based on the contractual agreement that institution may have with a given publishing company, whether it be like Elsevier or Wiley or whoever it may be.
There was an analysis that right now the institutions are paying for the subscription. So could all the money which is going into subscription can actually cover the cost of open access publishing from the same institute? Actually, the open access publishing is more expensive than which can be covered by all the subscriptions which a particular institute has. So yes, there is actually a bigger hole in between publishing. And with so many journals coming up, I think that hole is going to get bigger and bigger.
Okay, thank you so much for that comment, Terry. We will go on to Dr. Tim Pollock from Ohio State, whose talk is around avoiding authorship conflicts and honorary authorships. Tim?
Great. Can you see my slides?
Yes.
Perfect. Well, I want to thank Dr. Weber and Dr. Kennedy and the SSAT for asking me to participate in the webinar tonight. And I have the topic, the assigned topic of authorship considerations, avoiding conflicts and dealing with honorary authorship. So we all know authorship matters because in academia, it's publish or perish. And frequently publications are the coins of the realm. We have grant funding, we have clinical excellence, but clearly when you're going up for promotion, frequently the number of publications, the quality of the publications, where you are in the authorship list, what's your H index, things like this are frequently topics of discussion. And so this topic creates a lot of anxieties, a lot of troubled seas, shall we say, for trainees and for junior faculty and even for senior faculty members. And there's lots of issues in this troubled sea, who to include, what should the order be, how do you handle group authorship, ghostwriters, honorary authorship, issues with power imbalances, honorary authorship, should you include that Dr. Kennedy because he's your boss or not? And all these issues have to be grappled with. So I'm going to outline some strategies to deal how to deal with different authorship issues that I took from a paper, which I'll be happy to share with you, and all these slides will be happy to share with you afterwards also. So the first strategy is to start early, right? I think one needs to initiate discussions about authorship very early, right when the project is being conceived, rather than when the paper is being prepared. That one needs to discuss in the very earliest phases when people are thinking about different ideas and projects about, where people will fall with regards to their role in any paper writing. And it may be even good at the beginning to put this down in the form of some type of authorship contract. Many trainees are kind of naive to authorship issues. And I think, many even senior faculty are ignorant and lack knowledge about authorship and perhaps how to handle this issue appropriately. So really early and honest and transparent communication amongst all the research team members is going to be really, really important. And then, as I mentioned, having some documentation of this conversation. What I have found, what's happened to me, is that you can have a conversation, and then as the project is coming along and the paper is coming along, it can start looking really good, right? And you're going to get into a really high impact factor journal, and then all of a sudden the cards start moving, start shuffling, and people start talking about where they think they should be in the authorship, and that's not exactly what you discussed at the beginning. So I think that what can inform the conversation are guidelines. So all of you need to be familiar with the different guidelines that are available and that we follow as authors, and we follow as editors of JOGs, but one shouldn't be constrained by these guidelines. The guidelines are typically divided in two categories. One is how to avoid authorship problems, and then how to deal with authorship issues once they've arrived. And as we all know, the best solution to any problem is prevention. So it's best to try to avoid authorship issues, because once you start having to deal with authorship conflicts, it can be quite thorny and also kind of erode personal and professional relationships. So there are several different guidelines that you should be familiar with. One is the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors, which I think is more focused on all of us as authors. And then there's also the Committee on Publishing Ethics, or the COPE guidelines. And those are more guidelines that are used by journal editors to kind of navigate some of the issues that we may face when we think there may be some improprieties or difficulties around authorship. So the International Committee of Medical Editors, otherwise known as the Vancouver Group, this is kind of the general universal guidelines of what should constitute authorship credit. So it's substantial contributions to the conception and design, acquisition of data, analysis and interpretation of the data. That's number one. Drafting or revising the paper with critical input. So I frequently say it's hard for 10 people to write a paper. Usually a couple of people write a paper, but all the co-authors should have input into critically revising it. And then everyone must give final approval of the version to be published. And I'll get into that later. Importantly, authors need to meet all three of these criteria, not just one, not two, but all three. And just providing funding or providing data, like I contributed patients or general supervision, does not constitute authorship. And I think that's really important. Now, some of the issue with these guidelines is what do we mean by substantial contribution, right? So my assessment of what is substantial contribution may be very different than what Dr. Weber or Dr. Kennedy think is substantial. So there is some subjectivity to this. And that has to do a little bit with, I will talk about later, about the culture of your institution or your group, about whether they tend to favor over inclusivity or kind of over exclusivity. The other issue that frequently comes up, not only about who is going to be an author, but what is the position of the authorship. And generally speaking, people like to be the first author because that's usually the author that gets cited, right? It's Kennedy et al. Or Weber et al. And this kind of also signals that this is the person who had the biggest contribution. So in my experience, there's been a lot of jockeying about who's going to be first author, especially amongst trainees or sometimes even junior faculty members and trainees. I always say if you have a senior faculty member who's jockeying with you about first authorship, unless you're publishing in like New England Journal of Medicine or Nature, you're probably working with the wrong senior faculty member, right? You know, most of the junior faculty, I would say, and trainees, we should be elevating them and they should be first authors. Usually the last author is the most senior member of the team, the person who kind of oversaw the whole project, who contributed to all the authorship criteria, but someone who's like largely responsible for the whole work. And then also sometimes the corresponding author comes up, that people like to be the corresponding author because they think it's like prestigious, or they'll be the one contacted about the paper. And I think that's something that can get worked out later on. So some groups have come up with different algorithms to try to figure out like what the ordership of the author should be. And again, I think this is difficult to do and is best done initially. I would say that the first author, typically, at least in my research group, is the person who came up with the idea, obviously with the help of other people in the research group and the mentor, but the one who has kind of championed the project and the idea, and the one who wrote the first draft and really kind of took a good hard swipe at writing the paper. That's who I think the first author typically is in our group. The other thing is looking at acknowledgements. So there are many people who will contribute to your paper, but they won't meet those guideline criteria that are set out by the ICMJE. And those people should be acknowledged in your paper. It is important, though, that you must get permission from those people to be acknowledged. And we've had issues even at JOGS where someone has contacted us after a paper has been published saying, I don't want to be acknowledged. Someone acknowledged me in that paper, I didn't give permission, and I want my name taken off of it. So one commonly thinks all the authors need to have permission, but even those in the acknowledgement need to have access to the paper and the data and have their permission. The other set of guidelines are the COPE guidelines. And the COPE guidelines are really more policies and practices for journals and publishers so they can navigate the publication ethics and high standards. And there's many different algorithms that COPE has put out that we refer to as editors when we come across any problems with regards to ethics around plagiarism, honorary authorship, ghost authorship, things like that. So it's important if people talking about COPE guidelines to at least be aware of it. As I mentioned before, it's very important to document their contributions and communicate frequently. People can make, comments or state claims, but they never follow through. I frequently see that, especially in these multi-center collaborations, people will kind of stake claim to like 10 research ideas, but then they never do it. They never write the papers, they never do the projects. But then when you go ahead and do the project, they'll say, well, no, I had stake claim to that idea a year ago. And then you'll kind of get into some issues about, well, whose idea is it? Who should be first author on the paper? So I think you really want to have a running document with all your collaborators that determines, who has stake claim to different ideas, who's going to be the lead author, who's going to be the senior author, and really keep track of all of this. Because as I said, once the paper is initiated, and especially as the paper concludes, it can be very difficult to navigate these things after the fact. And you really have to inculcate a culture of transparency and open scholarship, and really discuss authorship more in the context of research outputs rather than the paper. People I sometimes think are so concerned about where they're going to be in the authorship, they forget you got to do the work, right? So I think, focus on what roles people are going to take and what work are they going to do with regards to the project and the paper. And then the authorship kind of flows from that. It's not the opposite, if you will, right? So in some sense, I'd say, let's focus on the work. And if you focus on the work and you do the work and you get it done, then, the authorship is tied to that. I think we do have to be aware, though, that Unfortunately, academic medicine is, replete with power imbalances, trainees working with more senior people, there's also, gender imbalances sometimes. And really, we need to be aware of any subtle bullying and or kind of power plays that people may play rather when authorship is being decided. And to that point, I think that responsible inclusivity needs to make sure that it avoids any implicit biases that can occur when we are documenting authorship. And it's been my kind of take sometimes is that more frequently, like men, and this is a generalization, but I'll say it anyways, are always telling me how important they are and how they should be first author and all this and that. And then sometimes I feel like sometimes my female faculty can be more self-effacing and a little bit more servant leaders and being like, oh, I understand, we should really put the medical student first. And so I think that all of us as leaders also need to advocate for our faculty and make sure that they are getting the credit that they are deserving and that they are not either overly stating their position in the paper or if they're overly understating their importance to the paper. I also think that we need to kind of broadly construe what we view as a contribution to the papers and make sure that we don't inflate people's contributions, but also that we don't underestimate their contributions either if they were important and perhaps coming up with the idea or framing the idea and things like that. So again, to that point, I think, make sure that we value diverse contributions and that when we're considering authorship, that we look for diversity of mechanisms to acknowledge the various contributions and promote a more inclusive and supportive environment. And this is not to suggest honorary authorship, it's to actually think about the people who maybe are actually contributing, but just in different ways to the paper than just being a senior person in the department who, paid for the electricity bill and is maybe paying for your salary. So some of these things are to think about, people who help with data interpretation, who provided feedback on research methods or other contributions to the manuscript. I think co-authorship conversations are obviously critically important when collaborating with groups. And then this issue of like co-first authors sometimes come up. I generally don't think co-first authorship is a great idea. I think on occasion, if people have truly contributed equally to the manuscript, we have employed it. But in general, I do not favor co-first authorship. I typically try to identify the person who contributed most to the work and the writing of the paper and have them be the first author. As I mentioned, I think, when considering authorship, you also have to consider this as a kind of intellectual property. And I think this especially comes up when you're doing like big science and working with many different groups and collaborating with people, perhaps not only from your institution, but multiple institutions. And it can get tricky about, who owns the data, who has access to the data, who has ownership of ideas, how are we going to decide, what ideas are prioritized or deprioritized, and how you as an individual can kind of get a piece of the pie of this larger collaborative group can be challenging. And given this, more and more we're seeing these large multi-center collaborations in surgery. A couple issues that have come up with authorship is the number of authors, and journals have attacked this by limiting the number of authors frequently. You can see more and more, I think, Annals of Surgery and some other papers limit the number of authors to 10 or 12. And you cannot include more authors in that. And if you want to include more authors in that, some journals will make you, you can include like a group authorship, maybe like, 6 authors, and then, the neuroendocrine collaborative. And so that can be okay, but I can tell you many collaborators don't like that because they want their name on the paper. They don't want the collaborative's name on the paper. And when you put the collaborative name on the paper, they kind of feel left out and that they're not real authors. So, this sometimes dictates, at least in my experience, where people want to submit the paper to. And if one journal has an authorship limit, sometimes your collaborators will say, I don't want to submit to that journal. I want to submit to a journal that allows 25 authors because I want all our names on the paper. But that may be a lower impact factor journal. And then you're like, well, I don't want to submit to that journal. I want to submit to the higher impact factor journal, and we're going to leave your name out. We'll put your name in the, So all these things, you have to discuss and negotiate and have give and take with your collaborators and figure this out. So that can lead to authorship disputes. When you're trying to figure all this out, it can be kind of tricky because, all of us have our own self-interests. And sometimes it's hard to be objective about those self-interests. So this can be particularly true of people maybe earlier on in their career. Unfortunately, I'll say I also frequently and older people who are very senior in their career, but are still trying to, I don't know why, but climb the mountain or stick a flag in the top of the mountain. And they're kind of thinking about themselves perhaps a little bit more than they should be, and not thinking about the other people on their team. So when this happens, you have an authorship conflict, I think the best thing to do is to try to work it out yourself. I think if you're a trainee and, a more junior person, I would try to look to one of your mentors who maybe is not involved and get advice from them. You could perhaps ask people to intercede on your part and do it in a very kind of non-threatening way. And I think sometimes that can work. You can also talk to the senior person yourself and try to understand where they're coming from with regards to the list of authors or whether you're included or not included. But then if that does not resolve, then you can kind of undergo a formal conflict resolution, which may involve your departmental chair or people at your College of Medicine who can help mediate or arbitrate some of these. This has happened to me occasionally. I think I've seen like twice in my career when someone like had like kind of an idea, started working on something, but then they left, like their time with me had been up, and then they left, and then we didn't include them because they literally contributed nothing. It was kind of like an idea they had mentioned as they were like leaving the building, so to speak. And they thought they should be an author, but they met no criteria whatsoever. And I remember someone kind of like, kind of filed a claim, and it was dismissed, obviously, but these things can get brought up, and you need to be aware of the formal mechanisms to adjudicate authorship disputes at your institution. And then, as I mentioned before, the norms around authorship can vary considerably. Some investigators kind of believe in like this big tent mentality, and they're kind of more inclusive, and they're looking for ways to include people and kind of construe substantial contributions kind of in a much broader way. Other places, can have a much narrower kind of focus on what authorship means. And what I found is that this can change within disciplines, whether it be like surgery or medicine or even like physics or economics, right? And it also can change within your institution. I've been in institutions that, kind of view like we're all in this together, we're all going to help each other, we're all going to work on papers together. And then there's other places where people kind of go it alone a little bit more. So one should familiarize yourself with the local norms, obviously still abiding by all of the rules of authorship, but kind of understand the local culture so you don't get sideways. And then finally, you need to be aware of these power differentials. And as I noted, these power differentials are just inherent between trainees and attendings, and even the kind of junior attendings to senior attendings. And they can leave trainees and junior faculty members vulnerable. And if you look at some surveys, there were many people, and say even like 1 to 5 will report that at some point in their career, they were kind of bullied. I can say that I definitely felt bullied I can remember a couple times where it got a little hairy, with some people I was working with, where like we had some throwdown fights about like authorship, which was like not the way we initially discussed it. Somebody was trying to move my cheese, And, there was definitely some conversations that were tough to have. And so that's when I think, trainees can sometimes feel like they have to cave into this pressure, and that they want to put senior faculty members on kind of as gift or honorary authors. And it's important to remember it's not who you are, but it's what you do, right? And guest or honorary authorship, I think, is ubiquitous. It is so prevalent. Some surveys say it's as high as 10 to 60%. I think it's all of that in surgery, and I've probably been guilty of it myself. And really, this honorary membership is when people really haven't met the criteria, they haven't worked for it, but we think by including them on the paper that it will either help the paper get in because we're putting a big name on the paper, or it's like a quid pro quo, right? Like, we're going to put you on this paper, then you're going to put me on your paper. Or I also think of this notion of the commodification of authorship. It's like traded on the open market, right? We kind of use it as coins and money that we're trading, like just other things, and that I'll garner favor with Dr. Kennedy if I include him on my paper, and that'll help me later on. And I really think, you need to avoid that. Honorary authorship is just not, ethical, and it's not what we want to be about as scientists, and it can get you into trouble. And it can get into trouble because when you include someone on a paper, not only do they have to meet all three of those initial criteria that I mentioned, but they also have to be accountable for the paper, for its accuracy and integrity. And there's been several instances where people are willing to accept the credit for the work, but they're not willing to accept the responsibility when something maybe fraudulent comes to light. And I've seen this happen where people have tried to disavow themselves from plagiarism or copying of figures, saying, well, yeah, I was senior author, yeah, I was co-author, but I read the paper, I wasn't really sure. You can't blame me for that. So I think, you should be thinking, can I take all the credit and can I take all the responsibility? And if you can't, you shouldn't be an author. If you can and you meet the criteria, then you should. And more journals are moving towards having authors actually declare, how they contributed to the paper. And I think most of you are probably familiar now that in many journals on the cover page, they will list the authorship criteria and ask for people to specifically put the names of the co-authors next to how they contributed. And then the co-authors must sign off on that to say that, yes, I did contribute to, conception, statistical interpretation, critical revision, and I did finally approve the paper. So I think when you sign those things, be aware of what you're signing and make sure that it's accurate. So this is my second to last slide, and it's just a schematic of kind of the things that I've gone over. I think some of the authorship disputes frequently arise from, inadequate discussion and planning, poor familiarity with guidelines. There's no records, nothing has been documented. I remember it one way, you remember it the other way. And then a lot of issues with power imbalance. And this can lead to conflict. And the ways to address this conflict, I think, is first of all, pausing, making sure that once a conflict arises, it should be dealt with. You shouldn't continue to push the paper forward or try to submit the paper if the conflict hasn't been resolved, because if it gets submitted and then gets accepted and you haven't resolved that conflict, it's going to cause you a world of hurt on the other side than if you just dealt with it. And you need to deal with it by communication, transparency, consulting the guidelines, meeting with your senior mentor one-on-one informally. And then if that does not work, to solicit an arbitrator or a mediator, usually your departmental chair and or someone from the College of Medicine. So in conclusion, authorship is a very complex topic, and it creates a lot of anxiety and potentially a conflict. The perspectives on authorship has evolved significantly over the last several decades with a strong move away from guest or honorary authorship, yet at the same time, encouragement of broadly construing how people can contribute to the paper and the projects in meaningful ways, so that we can kind of broaden our approach to kind of justice, equity, and diversity and inclusion in the academy, if you will. And so I guess what I'd leave you with is, plan ahead, build channels for communication, be transparent, be flexible, and as always, like most things in life, make it merit-based. If you do the work and you deserve the authorship, then you need to fight for that and align yourself with people in your career who will support you more than themselves, and develop lifelong relationships, mentorship, sponsorship to advance your career. So with that, I'll conclude. I'll be happy to answer any questions. And again, I thank Dr. Weber and Dr. Kennedy for the opportunity to present to you all tonight.
Dr. Pollack, thank you for that. That was a really outstanding talk. And I suspect many on the call, myself included, can go into issues related to authorship that they've gotten into. It can get really ugly. So I think having this discussion, as you've laid out, is really great. We'll open up for questions. We do have a couple of questions in the chat room, which I'm going to read out unless somebody has one to throw out. Verbally, I don't hear anything. So the first question comes from Imran Hassan, Dr. Pollack. Just thinking about in academic centers, promotion and tenure committee views on publishing open access journals, are they viewed differently from publishing in regular journals? What's your experience there, Dr. Pollack, in guiding your faculty members?
I think, so I've been on P&T committees both at Hopkins and here at Ohio State. My general impression is that people care more about the impact factor of the journal, because there's some really good open access journals that have good impact factors and are respected in the field. And then also, your H index, which for those of you who don't know, that's, basically the number of papers that have been the number of citations. So if your H index is 10, that means that you have 10 papers that have been cited 10 or more times. So I think people are looking for the impact of the journals that you're publishing in, and then the impact of your work, which is a surrogate member of your your H index, because that is some suggestion of how frequently other people in the field are citing your papers. Right. Whether it's open access or not open access, I don't think matters as much.
Yeah, and that's what Dr. Melton Mukes said as well. Dr. Hassan, I don't know if you read that. Any other comments on that issue, V Costa or Sharon?
No, I echo Tim's thoughts that, I have not served on P&T committees, but what my understanding is the impact factor is much more valuable than the open access versus, and there are more and more, even the good journals are having now open access options. So open access really doesn't make much. What one has to watch for is, because there are so many predatory journals online who are really reaching out to you and saying, please give me
the other thing. It's outpatient technically.
Send us your manuscript. We will be obliged, and you feel good, you send them manuscript, and they're asking for money in the next email. So,
and then they keep them longer if there's an issue.
Dr. Welsh, can you mute yourself, please? Amy muted me too. So the other question here in the chat room, Dr. Pollack, is from Dr. Dawood, who asks about the documenting in this early discussion of authorship, and what does that actually look like in your practice? Do you put it in an email? Do you actually put it down in a formal contract? Do you start the paper right up front and start listing authors as you discuss it? What's that look like for you?
Yeah, so I think the first thing is just trying to work with people you can trust. I mean, it sounds like an easy thing, but I think that's try to find mentors who you can talk with, you can have a relationship with, you feel comfort level with. that to me, that's the most important thing, because, you know, anything that's written down, you know, yes, it's good, but it can still get changed. So I think the most important thing is, can you trust this person? Do you really feel like they have your best interests in mind? That's my first thing. The second thing is, I would probably recommend just like a casual email to start off with, because I think it can be very off-putting if you're trying to write a paper with me and then you show up with your, like, I'm being facetious here, but you show up with your lawyer and some 3-page document, you want me to sign a contract that, like, you know, commits you to being first author in the paper. I mean, like, what's going on here? This person doesn't trust me. So I think, though, if you write an email, then it's just like, you know, I'm excited about this project. I'm going to work really hard on it. I'm excited about being first author, something like that. Then there's at least a little bit of a paper trail, because sometimes it's not malicious, but I may forget, right, that we ever talked about that. And then there's at least an email. You can say, hey, Dr. Pollock, remember I sent you that email 6 months ago and you said I was going to be first author. And I'm like, oh yeah, you're right. You are. I did say that. So I think that's kind of how I would play it initially. I think for larger collaborative groups that we've all been part of, it can get a little bit more formal, because when you're trying to work with like 10 centers, you're getting a database of like 1,000 patients, and you have like 20 ideas that people want to write 20 papers on over the next 3 years. It needs to get a little bit more formal about who is going to, you know, have, you know, priority for different researchers' ideas. So that I've seen get a little bit more formalized.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great. And then another question just came into the chat room here from Dr. Shaw. If a resident does 80 to 90% of the work, and 6 months later, another resident comes in and takes over the work and sees it to completion, including manuscript submission, who should be the first author, in your opinion, for that project? This is something that comes up not infrequently, isn't it? So this is a good question, Dr. Pollock. What do you think?
You know, I think it depends. I mean, I think we all have to be honest with ourselves too. And, you know, sometimes, no disrespect, but sometimes the resident thinks they've done 80 to 90% of their work and they haven't, right? You know, they may have, you know, tried really hard. They might have tried 110%. But perhaps like sometimes like the paper draft they wrote or the analysis that they did, it needs to be completely redone, right? That has happened sometimes. So then, you know, an honest mentor would go and say, hey, Greg, I know you wrote that draft, you did this analysis. I know you've gone back to your clinical work. It was a little rough. You know, we're going to have to redo it. So I've talked to Sharon. She's going to essentially have to redo the whole thing. So Sharon's going to be the first author now, and you're going to be the second author. Those can be hard conversations, but if Sharon really does have to redo the whole paper, then she really should be the first author. On the flip side, though, if that resident really did do 80 to 90%, then I think that they should still be the first author, as long as they're, in my opinion, they have to be committed to the project. So when it comes back for revisions, they're going to help out with those things. They're going to still be around to help. So I guess my answer would be to talk to your mentor to get clarity around really how much of the work have you done as the resident, and does it still warrant first authorship? And if it does, you physically not being there should not matter, right? What matters is, did you do the work?
Yeah, it's a great answer. Yeah, Genevieve.
I may just follow up on that by commenting that has happened to, I think, every single one of us. And I think from a resident perspective, I would just say it is a great example of why when you start a project, just take it home and finish it. Sometimes what happens is the people who get caught in the middle and can't finish the project, like the mentor is trying to find a way to get it in print. And so just making sure that you have that carry through to finish the project is really important from having scenarios like that play out. And I think often that's why.
Yeah, that's great advice. Genevieve, do you have a comment?
I was just going to reinforce what Sharon just said. And also I think there is a recency bias that takes place, and getting it over the line. And if you can maintain that continuity, then perhaps there is a better chance of maintaining that first authorship.
We face that quite a bit in basic science, because in many papers would last 3-4 years, and the resident came, he did the They will do the models, which they are very good at, get it done. But when the basic science and really getting into the Western blots and those things come, that takes 3-4 years, and it's really a struggle which I face on a daily basis.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great. That's great. Great discussion. Any other questions? Maybe one more in the chat room here. As far as a mentor to tell a resident did a good amount of work and is not available anymore for review responses and revisions. Yeah, it is. That's a great point, Mihar. So thank you. Any other comments or questions from the group? Not seeing any, why don't we move on to our last talk? Dr. Genevieve Melton-Mukes is here with us. She's at the University of Minnesota, where she's a professor of surgery and also the Chief Analytics and Care Innovation Officer for Fairview Health. She is a world-renowned colorectal surgeon and a health informatics researcher, and really is in an ideal position to talk about readership versus impact factor, what's best for your research and career. So Genevieve, thanks a lot for coming and joining us tonight.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Kennedy, and also to Dr. Weber. Really appreciate the opportunity, and thank you for hosting this. And also thanks to SSAT for sponsoring this. And, I think last but not least, but it was exciting and both challenging to really think about this topic and consider really just sort of what this whole peer review process is about. And if the first two haven't already shown this, it really is a pound of flesh that we all go through in this peer review process. And we all have our stories about that process to finally get that manuscript to its home. And some of this is not really tongue-in-cheek, it's actually a bit accurate. So, really at the end of the day, the best advice on thinking about where to publish is really placing your research into context. And I think without that, it becomes difficult to really know where that home should be. And, just like that conversation around authorship, it should be as well about the home of where this research should go. So, think about your audience. I happen to be a colorectal surgery. Certainly if a group of us are publishing on something that is very impactful throughout surgery, it's a lot different to have that versus, we're going to be publishing about anorectal disease, or I happen to publish a lot in informatics, which is a relatively small field. So maybe if what I'm working on applies very broadly to healthcare delivery, I might have a really large audience. But if I'm doing something about a very piece of minutia in detail and methodology, I am going to have a small audience. So really thinking about that's important, as well as that idea about the novelty of the work and really placing that into context. What have you found? What will this mean to other folks that think about this, or the broader writ large society? What will this work mean? And I'm going to specifically touch on impact factor, the idea about readership and circulation, which I think is actually a pretty evolving concept, especially in our digital world. And Vikas touched on open access. And finally, I'm going to talk a bit about pre-publication. And I'm glad that Vikas didn't touch on that, because I think it's an important avenue for folks to think about. So it is the Goldilocks phenomena again, and I think I sort of alluded to this up front, just right. Who cares about that research, placing it into context, again, its significance, and then really considering, with all of that in mind, what would a stretch look like? What would great success look like for that particular piece of work, and laying that out. But, I do think that, when we say what's most important, the prestige or the readership, the answer is good or bad. Prestige still does matter. And it is something that we do need to keep in mind when we're thinking about where that home should be. And in fact, despite, faculty increasingly saying, I just want to reach my core constituents. I just want to reach other colorectal surgeons. You know, still impact factor matters explicitly. It matters in almost half of promotion and tenure processes. So it is important to keep an eye on it. So what do we want to think about? I'm moving the people across so you can see as I go. What do we want to think about with impact factor? And, you know, really, despite the fact that impact factor has been around for 50 years, so it's a really old metric, and it has some shortcomings, it still remains a core yardstick that we use. So it's defined as the average number of citations that a particular publication as the entire journal has had in the preceding 2 years on average. And most commonly, you'll see the Thomson-Reuters Web of Knowledge Index, which is done annually. There's several other journal rank factors that are out there, but still impact factor remains the most common one. And, you know, there are multiple examples of why it falls short. So I'll give you two in particular. One is that you can game the system. And there have been publishers out there that have really used this to their advantage. So there was, for instance, in my field in informatics, where I do a lot of my research, there was a journal that would encourage, after a paper was going through reviews, and they would suggest, why don't you cite this article? Why don't you cite this one? And they were articles that were published in their journal. And there have been examples of others. Here's an example of one you can see in the references for anesthesia where this was occurring. And there is also examples of where you can see that there is a skewing because of how the metric is constructed. Because what they do is they'll take, on average, if you have a couple of papers that are very, very highly cited, it can make the overall impact factor falsely go up. So surprisingly, if you look at these journals that you think are great journals that everybody's going to cite widely, there are multiple publications that come through these journals that get very few citations. So examples of things in Nature, Cell, that literally have less than 100 citations a couple years out. But the ones that do get cited quite a lot skew the overall impact factor. So it just is important to keep in mind. The metric is the metric, and it's not great. So really, I think, you know, if there is, you know, an overall biggest piece of important advice, it's really to look at your publication record like you would an investment portfolio. Think of yourself as an investor and think about creating that balanced portfolio. So again, impact factor being one thing that you should be looking at. Again, your promotion and tenure committee is not going to look at that exclusively, but it's going to be one factor. So it's really important that if you can, get at least a few publications in high impact journals if you can. You know, you don't want everything in a low impact journal. On the flip side, there's the idea of readership, because if the article is going to be seen and touched by a larger readership, then in turn, ideally, it's going to end up having more impact. Folks are going to cite it more. Folks are going to read about this more, and hopefully it will touch practice more. But, you know, in some ways, readership was really based off of physical paper journals, right? So subscriptions that were reaching folks. And today in this digital world, what V Costa just talked about with open access, really it's kind of an obsolete concept. So, you know, these idea of downloads, but does downloads really mean that it's going to be cited and is going to create more knowledge? Not necessarily, because you know, the lay press, if you look at COVID as a, for instance, all the papers that have been downloaded, it doesn't always equal citation. So again, just this idea of sort of balancing these two. But ultimately, it's really about your individual scientific impact. And Dr. Pollack talked a bit about this, but this idea of your H index, really based off of your most cited papers and the number of citations, that they have received from other folks. You'll see H index. There's other variants. The other one that you'll see pretty often is the I-10 index with at least 10 citations is another one. And you'll also see these indices overall, and then you'll see it for a period of time. So you might see the H index for the past 5 years as a for instance, or even 10. I've seen in a couple of instances. I think the bottom line message here is learn what your institution is looking at. So at my institution, we had to cite our H index and the I-10 index, and then you had a choice of listing it from several sources, so Google Scholar versus Thomson Reuters, et cetera. So just understand the game that you're playing and what that will look like as a whole. But again, this idea of balanced, some of the most cited papers don't necessarily have to be in the highest impact journal, as long as they're reaching their readership and they're going to be used. Okay, so really I'm glad that I have, just a few minutes at the end here to talk about pre-publication, because it is a newer concept. And I think it's an example of where you get the chance to not be exclusively one thing or the other. You can do both. You can get your work out there quickly. So pre-publication, I'm going to show you sort of the forum that you can do this in, allows you to basically set a mark and say, here's my findings. I'm going to share it with the world. So instead of having to wait months, you can publish almost instantaneously. Certainly in basic science, this is a really important thing where folks are getting constantly scooped. So being able to set a time mark there is really, really important. It can be citable. I think certainly if you're looking at sending something in for consideration for a grant, having a pre-publication before it ends up going through the full peer review process is a way to add additional legitimacy to your preliminary findings. So it's something to really keep in mind. One of the downsides is even though you can find things that are in pre-publication on PubMed, it doesn't count necessarily as an official citation. So we have an example as a, for instance, something that we sent into pre-publication almost 9 months ago, which we've gotten a lot of legs on. It's an AI model that we put into practice, but it's still in the pre-publication phase, and we think it's finally accepted. It's very close, but it took that entire period of time. But all those citations in the meantime really don't count. So that's one potential downside. And it does, again, create this ability, though, to share your work earlier. So certainly if you want to keep your work secret a little bit longer, you don't do this. But if you want to get the word out and you want to disseminate quickly, I think this is something to consider. So the forum that you would do this, it's a collaboration through BMJ, Yale, Cold Spring Hardware Laboratory, is the medRxiv. It's only been around for a couple of years. It's free. Again, available in PubMed almost instantaneously. So something to consider and to look at. So it is an evolving landscape. Good or bad, we currently still have impact factor, the idea of readership, but really just, remember that it is a changing landscape, that because things are more digital now with open access, et cetera, really keep your eye on what this area continues to do, because it is going to continue to change. Think about your research portfolio as this sort of balanced portfolio, build it up, track it. Also think about other ways that you're disseminating. So again, if you do demos, if you are disseminating in other ways, again, just think about in terms of all the ways you can do that as a surgeon, and then again, amplify what you disseminate. And think about, again, that Goldilocks idea, because it does make a difference in how you think about the final home. And again, consider that pre-publication. Hopefully it's something that if you haven't heard about, that you'll consider in the future. So with that, I will end and take some questions.
Genevieve, thank you so much. That was a great talk. We will open it up for questions, and I see one in the chat. What is the average age index that is expected before consideration for promotion to associate professor and professor?
So this is Genevieve. I can give you an opinion on it. I don't think that there's an exact number for that, for a couple of reasons. If you are going up for associate professor, I think at that stage, hopefully the trajectory of number of publications is going up quite a bit. And your most recent publications are going to have the least number of citations. So in most cases, I think the H-index is going to be relatively low for what it will be, you know, a few years later. So I don't think there's an actual average number, and I don't know what other folks have experienced. I've sat on a P&T committee here, and that has been the case, but I don't know what others have experienced. There certainly are some guidelines around number of publications, and I think certainly as well about looking at, again, at that whole idea of impact factor as a whole.
I think part of the struggle is that the promotion committee's expectations are so different institution to institution, and you really have to know what the expectation is at your place, and that can be wildly different from one place to another, and then with multiple different tracks. I think that's a very difficult question to answer.
Yeah, I think the other comment is tell the story about your field the best you can and what you are trying to sort of build yourself up as a scientist. So that example with informatics is a real one. I think the highest impact journal in informatics maybe is a 6 or so. And then the next best is like in the 4 range. So that's, you know, it's not as good as, you know, several of the surgical journals as a, for instance. So if that's what you're judged on, you have to be able to give an idea of relative placement of those journals according to that forum.
Yeah, it comes down to excellence, right? For promotion by and large. It's not necessarily that one thing, H-index or whatever. I don't think it comes down to making your comment or your statement for excellence in your field, whether it's in education or service or research, right? And excellence in education might be almost no publications, but rather a demonstration that you've done something great for the institution in the world of education. So I think it's not a set script, at least in my experience. I don't know if Dr. Pollack has any other comments on that experience.
Yeah, I would just echo those comments. I think it's you know, it's very different nowadays. I think Dr. Weber said it best, is you should really familiarize yourself with the different criteria for promotion at your own institution. And then Dr. Kennedy also highlighted that, you know, there's so many different tracks nowadays that the criteria for promotion are dramatically different based on what track you may be on. So, I mean, obviously, I think if you're on the research track or the tenure track, then things like H-index or funding is going to be much more important than perhaps if you're on the clinical excellence track or the education track. So best to meet with your P&T representative early to understand what exactly are the criteria in your department.
I have a quick question. So for this RIV, the repository where you can store your manuscripts or timestamp them, but does that timestamping have any, I mean, I don't think there is any legal recourse, but if, let's say, you put it out there and somebody, you know, takes the idea, puts the manuscript first, do you have any recourse, or is it?
Yeah, you do. You could, if somebody else publishes it in another journal, depending upon when they submitted, yeah, you definitely do have a recourse. And I think I think this definitely accelerated during COVID because folks were trying to get their findings out as quickly as possible, literally because, you know, because of how important it was to everybody. So certainly I know, at least at our institution, we saw a lot more of it. And I don't know how much it will end up catching on, but it is a weird, you know, it is a tension, right? Because in some ways, sometimes it's to your advantage to keep things slightly quieter while you're working, you know, getting further ahead. But on the flip side, in theory, we all want to be disseminating and moving the science forward. So.
We are at 8:30, and I would just extend a really generous thank you to our speakers who just gave such a lovely presentations and pulled this all together so nicely. So thank you very much, and to Dr. Kennedy, my co-moderator.
Great. Thank you, Sharon. Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone, for being on the call. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you
you.
for having me.
Have a good night.